Okay, so we're going to be talking about DWR, which is a Java server-side technology, and Ext, which isn't. It's client-side, it's JavaScript. I'll warn you now, this presentation was prepared in a JavaScript environment, so have an allergy. Basically, quickly, going to talk about what the AJAX sort of landscape is today and where we've come from. Then I'm going to show a little bit about DWR, very briefly, what it is and what it does for you. Then I'm going to kind of introduce Ext into the picture, and kind of coming from the client side back. Then just talk about a couple of the integration challenges you may have, integrating Ext with DWR in particular, but also more generally with sort of server-side technology. And then I'm just going to kind of show you the pet store, which, well actually it's the pet clinic application, which comes bundled with the Spring distribution. So many of you may have seen it. It's a very simple application, but going to sort of jazz it up a bit. Okay, so, well, what is AJAX? Well, it was coined about 3 years ago by James Garrett. I mean, the whole concept of sort of dynamic page refreshes has been done in various ways since, IE 4, back in the days of yore, when Microsoft actually came up with quite good innovations. And it's become now a standard feature. But the AJAX in itself, the ability to refresh load content out of band, so to speak, it isn't necessarily the whole picture. What it's opened up is people have really realised what they can do with the browser. The browser, plus JavaScript, is actually very powerful, if occasionally broken, information sort of application tool. So, just to kind of, the landscape has really grown vastly over the last 3 years. 3 years ago, the idea of an AJAX toolkit was maybe a 30 lines of JavaScript that wrapped, to provide a convenience method to do an AJAX call. But now you can actually speak of a whole AJAX toolkits. I suppose most of you may be familiar with some of these items on here. These are all pretty much also JavaScript frameworks. Over here we've got a couple of honourable mentions of Java server-side technologies which generate JavaScript, like GWT. But I've got a kind of fairly arbitrary taxonomy here, which is the low-level ones, which are all about just moving things around in the page, way up to the high-level ones, which are about constructing widgets and kind of reusable chunks of functionality. And you kind of got these ones in the middle, like script packets, which, well, doesn't really have that much in the way of widgets. It has like auto-completers, but it's mainly about doing things to the page. And this is, of course, a fairly small selection of the most popular ones, because there are, the world and his dogs come up with what they call an AJAX framework. I suppose it comes down to this. You can't actually, unfortunately, the shading has disappeared, but this is James Garrett's original sort of diagram showing the difference between the classic application and an AJAX application. And a lot of marketing spiel has been made about what are called Web 2.0 single-page applications. That is, applications which, instead of using the traditional series of load the customer page and then you navigate from the customer page to the order page, they pretty much load one page and then selectively load bits of data and show and hide bits of the page depending on the state of the application. Much more like a client-server application than the traditional web browser model. So again, this kind of illustrates that the browser UI engine can be seen as doing sort of almost like RPC calls to the server to return fragments of data. This being AJAX, how can you actually get the data back? Well, the X in AJAX is of course XML, and Ext HTML is the most obvious choice for sending data back to the browser, and indeed this was pretty much for the infancy of AJAX. It was the idea, but there are alternatives. JSON is one which we'll be talking about quite a lot, and of course, XML. You can return arbitrary XML to the browser. So, obviously, XHTML, it's the markup your mama would know. It's very straightforward, easy to render, easy to do. Quite, obviously it's very quick to insert into a page, and this is pretty much what people used to understand was AJAX. Period. Then of course we've got XML itself. So you can produce any XML document and send it down to the browser and run XSLT over it, do XPath. Interestingly, of course, you could use web services. Sorry.
You said you can send XML down to the browser, but does the browser have an XSLT already inside it?
Well, that's the problem. It's as I sort of mentioned there. It's inconsistent across browsers. I think because you can get the ActiveX, you can in IE you can grab the Microsoft one, but there's not a standard API. So you need to do this in JavaScript, and there are libraries that do this. So AJAX SLT I think is one of them. But basically, yes. You can traverse this and do this, and it may or may not be fairly quick. And indeed, some of the AJAX libraries have taken a very XML-centric approach, like Backbase, which was a Dutch commercial library with a ludicrously expensive license, bought by some financials. It was very good, but 2 years ago they were doing this XML-centric thing where they would send down a whole bunch of the markup as XML, and then it would parse, construct the user interface from it. XML, it works, and of course, just to reiterate, you can consume web services. So there is actually a JavaScript SOAP client. If you really want to, you can actually pull in your SOAP services and sort of make AJAX clients for your SOAP services, which kind of sounds really good, but in practice, it's questionable why you'd ever want it. Bearing in mind stuff to do with cross-site scripting and sort of security concerns. So the final thing is JSON, and I'm going to talk a lot about JSON because it's popularised by Douglas Crockford, who is one of the fathers of JavaScript, or at least one of the great evangelizers of JavaScript. Basically, JSON is JavaScript object notation. So it's curly braces with string literals as key value pairs. Really all there is to it. You can nest them by putting more braces. You probably can't, unfortunately, can't quite make that out. But basically, like the address there is just a set of braces, some more string literals. We can nest any structure. Pretty much the same way. It's very similar to XML, except with slightly less verbose. The great thing about JSON is it's pretty readable. Everything's just strings. If you indent, you can indent it and kind of make it work. Another great thing is because of point one, it's JavaScript object notation. It's the native markup for object literals in JavaScript. This means it's very, very efficient for JavaScript to parse because it doesn't really have to do much. It's as efficient as loading it from a .js file on the server in terms of the parse time. It's easy to generate, and we'll be talking in a moment about how you do that. It's a universal sort of technology agnostic thing because it's just strings. It doesn't really make any assumption about what you're going to do with them. It's lightweight. There's not really much to it. What you see is exactly what you get. It's loaded into the browser using eval. Now, this is great because it's such a cool thing to be able to load objects into memory, into JavaScript memory on the fly. But this has some important caveats. Eval is a relatively expensive operation because it basically creates a dynamic scope within the browser. Also, there are some security concerns because eval is just basically it's code injection. So this is one of the big issues that people have been talking about in the kind of the AJAX world about cross-site scripting and code injection. Because if you're, for example, if for some reason your JSON contained function definition, it could potentially get executed. So you kind of need to be aware of that and kind of careful about it. So JSON, how as Java developers do we make this? Well, the most obvious and low-tech solution is to do it by hand, because it's all just strings. There are other ways, of course. Where there's a need, there's a taglet, and in this case there are several. But I'll just show you one of them. There's obviously serializers which do this for you. And if your framework supports it, like if you use Structs to web work, then you can just use a JSON result type and it'll do it for you. Finally, you can do it using DWR. And we'll talk about that later. So, doing it by hand. Well, it's just here's a ELB JSP with some cout tags, just the JSTL. One very important caveat here is that new lines and quotes are very important to JSON. Because if, for example, my customer.address, street address had a new line in it, that would break if I didn't escape the new lines correctly. So that's the main thing you need to worry about when just splurging JSON out from a JSP page. You basically, it's very sensitive to that. So you probably want to either pre-process the strings or have a trivial tag that does that escaping for you. So really not much to it. So JSON taglet. So again, it's a very simple tag library, but it pretty much it gets around the pitfalls of the manual approach on the previous slide. You basically just give it, give it your EL expression. Everyone's comfortable with JSP, EL, no issues there. Right, cool. So basically just EL expressions, and it will do all the escaping, and it also does nice stuff like you can iterate over arrays, pretty much like a C for each, and it will generate quite compact output. I guess, you can use a serializer. JSONlib is a serializer, it works. Does as good as a good job. It can also serialize from JSON to Java. So it will try and marshal your objects from JSON to Java, which can be very useful in certain circumstances. So you can do bidirectional binding. But in this case, we are serializing to a string. So essentially, we've got an arbitrary object, a customer object, and then we just throw it at the JSON serializer. It will introspect the properties. You can obviously provide the serializer with metadata to say, actually, I only want to marshal these properties, or if you marshal these properties, you want to use them. Sorry.
It's all right. I'm sorry to interrupt. If customer was from Hibernate or persistence capable object.
Yeah, obviously, you need to be careful with that. As with any serialization, you need to be careful about not marshalling your entire object graph. You need to provide a configuration object as like a second argument in this to the serializer to say, if you hit this property, then skip it. Mm-hmm. So if you're serializing a customer and the customer has an orders property which actually contains like 3,000 rows, mm-hmm. Well, you probably want to skip that. Basically you just throw your object. It can be an object, it can be a map, it can be a collection, anything reasonable. Throw it in there, and then you'll get this JSON container, which is really just a wrapper around the generated string, and then you just go to string. And so you can sling that down in, in a plain vanilla servlet, in a struct section, however you want to get it down to the browser. So I mean it's pretty simple, fairly low tech, but very effective. So the final sort of thing I'll talk about in terms of getting your data onto the browser is DWR. So DWR, I mean, is kind of one of the leading server-side Java technologies for doing AJAX because it's so damn useful. It's founded by Joe Walker about 3 years ago. It's gone from strength to strength. It's used in a lot of places. It claims to be easy AJAX for Java, and I would very much agree. There's really, I'll show you, we'll talk about the steps required to get it up and running, but there aren't many. And it basically provides a sort of JSON RPC interface for Java. What I mean by that is that it provides JavaScript versions of your server-side methods, right? So you can call them on the client, so and it will marshal the parameters and execute on the server and then return the result, which frankly is very cool because you don't have to write any extra code for that. That's all done for you. Okay, so to dive right in, how do we get started? Well, basically, DWR is a server, and it sits, and you typically map it to a URL pattern like /DWR. Then the server expects a config file typically called DWR.xml, but you can call it whatever you want. And what this does is define all the classes you want to expose to JavaScript. There are various ways of getting these classes because, as with all good contemporary libraries, it provides integration with all of the kind of frameworks you're likely to use. Spring, structs, JSF, page flow. You can even use dynamically created scripted beans like Groovy components, and straight old Java new if you have just OJs. So I mean, in this case, okay, we've got a fairly minimal DWR.xml, right? Ignore that bit. So what they're saying is allow, because obviously exposing your server-side services via JavaScript can be a security nightmare. So from the get-go, it sort of has a very explicit thing that you have to allow it to expose your beans. And you can also specify which beans which methods on each bean you wish to expose. So in this case, we've got to create, it's being created by Spring, so it will look in the Spring web context for a bean called some service bean, and it will export it to JavaScript as my DWR bean. And when it does so, it will make all the methods that you've allowed it to do available in JavaScript. Okay, if you're using Spring MVC and you're using Spring MVC 2, you can use a rather snazzy schema-based configuration, which basically plugs right into your Spring MVC servlet, dispatcher servlet config, which it provides nice because it's all nice and type safe, and it basically means you can remote any of your Spring beans by just adding this DWR remote element to the bean definition. But it's kind of cool. But if you're not using Spring MVC, then it's not hugely relevant. Right. So before I move on to that, I'll just show you what DWR looks like. DWR, rather helpfully, includes a debug page. If you set the debug equals true, if you just hit the slash DWR mapping, it's pretty much like most web services stacks. It will tell you about the services it knows about, or equally it tells you about the JavaScript services it knows about. So kind of getting ahead of myself, but I've got two beans exported here called DWR Clinic. There's this one, and it has a bunch of methods. And as you can see, these are straight methods. I'll show you the server-side code. So as you can see, that's my feed, and that's what it gets turned into. So I can now execute any of these methods, and they'll get pushed to the server, and I'll get the result back. So if I hit that one, and you'll see it's marshaled some objects, a collection of objects to JSON. You can see they've got some properties. So here, a bunch of properties, including dates, which of course, because it knows how to marshal or primitive properly. Yeah, so basically using, as it says at the top of the page, to use DWR, you basically just do a script include, right, on these pages, and then you just do it then exposes. So if I actually look at the .js file, this has been generated on the fly. It exposes some methods to JavaScript. So, for example, DWR.getPets. And then they can be called like any other JavaScript method.
Do you? Is anything significant about DWR clinic?
No.
As against the original?
I can call it, that's a good point. No, I can call it whatever I want. It really doesn't care what you call it. It's just I happen to call mine being that name. Because I don't have, just because for convenience to call it the same thing as my class, but I can call it whatever the hell you want. It really makes no difference.
But you could have exposed it, because I see you wrapping a clinic there.
Oh yeah. I could have exposed the clinic itself.
Yeah.
But as with web services, you probably want to have a proxy. I mean, there are certain cases where you wouldn't, but it's useful to have like a delegate, to have a kind of wrapper in a delegate model, because then you can say, well, actually, I really don't want to expose these three methods, or I want to change the signature of these three methods, because obviously being a remoting mechanism, there are certain things which are slightly awkward, and so you might want to change the way they work. Right. So, I mean, kind of at this stage, any kind of questions about DWR? People sort of vaguely comfortable about what it is, what it does? It's a way of calling, marshalling from JavaScript to your server-side methods, and then marshalling results to JSON and getting them back in the browser, which is a pretty cool thing. So, I guess now let's talk a bit about Ext.
Sorry, yeah. Does it also work with ActionScript? Or you also set up with also communication with ActionScript?
ActionScript. I don't know, to be honest. I've not tried it. I mean, it might well be, because ultimately it just renders JavaScript. So if you can call it from JavaScript, you can use DWR.
It's not direct.
No. But I mean, it is quite extensible. So there are a lot of ways you can work with it. Okay, so Ext. Ext originally started off as a sort of spin-off project from YUI. YUI is the Yahoo UI library, which came about as a result of Yahoo's getting more involved in the open source world and kind of making publicly available some of the components that they use to build their web apps. So it's been going for a few years. I think it might be 2006. But the focus is, as it suggests, it's rich, high-quality components that look great out of the box, because the components that have the wow factor. It has. What's also important is theming, because the getting consistent look and feel across your widgets, across your page, is a real, can be a real pain to do. Another thing which is a real strength for Ext is its API documentation. It actually has some. It's pretty comprehensive. Obviously, it can't tell you absolutely everything, but it's certainly by a long shot the best I've seen. I mean, if you look at other libraries out there in that space, like Dojo. I mean, Dojo is arguably it was the big library. For a while, it was the only big JavaScript sort of library out there, and the documentation for it isn't great. Another very important point about Ext is that it's object-oriented. I'll show you very briefly what that looks like and what that means later. But that is quite a big step forward for JavaScript. It's widely used. It's growing very quickly, and the forums are actually helpful. People are knowledgeable and really enthusiastic, and that's I think a big plus. And there are also, because it's extensible, people have written some seriously cool plugins for it to do all sorts. So basically, to backtrack, Ext is a pure JavaScript library for the construction of rich web applications. It's not for everyone. Sorry?
I was going to say, just ask one question about Ext. Is it basically for its low-level components? Is everything basically part of Ext, or does it use any other third-party libraries as building blocks?
That's actually a very good point. Because it started off as YUI, it was built on top of YUI. Since I think 1.1.0, it was separated from YUI. So you can use it standalone, or it comes with adapters, which mean you can use it on top of other popular frameworks like Prototype, jQuery, YUI obviously, and possibly new tools. Maybe just those three. So yes, it does work standalone, but it plays nicely with other JavaScript tools. So you can use Prototype as a foundation if you want. Okay, well, I have to say up front, it's not for everyone. It may not be for you. If you don't like writing JavaScript, well, you may not like writing JavaScript now, but you may come to love it. And if not, well, it's not, because it's a JavaScript library. It's not really best suited to what people describe as unobtrusive JavaScript environments, wherein you have a page of just straight markup, and then you have scripts that load into it and transform and enrich the behavior. You can do that with Ext. That is entirely possible, but I think that the focus and its real strength is when you come from the JavaScript first approach, where you construct your user interface using Ext. It's a fairly large library, so I wouldn't want to load it into into a Nokia mini phone. But it does work on the iPhone and also the N95 within Linux, because obviously your usability on a screen that big, you need to design for it. But it does actually, it works fine with the JavaScript implementations there. You don't want to go overboard, but it's not at all impossible. So, as I was kind of alluding to, it contains solutions for most of the things that bother web application developers. And I broadly sort of put them into fairly arbitrary categories. With layout, it does a lot of layout, and anyone who's wrestled with getting floats to work properly in CSS, in a relatively complicated layout, will kind of feel that pain. It takes care of all of that for you. It does rich tables and grids with more functions thrown in for free than you can shake a stick at. It does rich forms with client-side validation, AJAX submission, all of this stuff. It does trees, It also does drag and drop, which kind of forms part of the other things. But I think it's a cool enough feature that I put it in its own little category. So basically here we have your first taste of what Ext code looks like. You'll notice that this looks awfully familiar, like the JSON we were looking at earlier. Well, that's because it is. This is Ext itself is generally configured with large bits of JSON. So it provides layout management. Now here's an example screenshot of a relatively complex layout. And this is using the viewport, and it's a border layout, which should be familiar from sort of swing development and all of that sort of stuff. So we've got a kind of centre panel, we've got the west, we've got the east, we've got the north and the south, and it will deal with the resizing and the kind of keeping the proportions correct. Actually, just to reiterate, resizing actually works. And again, anyone who's wrestled with CSS layouts that look great for a single page size and resize and scale properly, you have my sympathy. It's not much fun. So yeah, we have some basically all of these things are wired up with so there's JavaScript with a bunch of JSON configuration. The general paradigm is you call these new constructors and you pass in just a block of configuration. So tables, we have rich tables. They look great. You get all the kind of features thrown in for like sorting, grouping, server or client side pagination, inline editing, which is a pretty cool thing. You get custom rendering, so you can render dates, you can render currency, anything really. And all of this is bound to JSON. So so basically, the concept is that you have an abstract data store, which is a piece of JavaScript that knows how to get some JSON, and you bind it to a grid, and the grid just takes care of all the display. Okay, so forms again. They look pretty cool. They have all the sort of stuff of nice date pictures, time pictures, combo. The combo box is a real Swiss Army knife that controls. You can use it for everything from straight pickers to select boxes to even to use it as a search field. You have forms themselves can be very complicated. So you can have nested tabs, you can have grids within forms, you can have any combination of controls you like. It also has a HTML rich text editor, which is rather nice. You've got trees. So here's a kind of simple example of a tree. Trees themselves they can be lazy loaded from the server, so you can have an arbitrary size tree and load it on demand. You can have custom behaviors, selection. One thing to sort of stress is that Ext is very event driven. So the typical programming model is you register listeners. So for example, the tree will have a node selected event, and so you can register a listener for the tree saying on node selected. It will pass as an argument the node selected in the tree, and then you can do stuff like, for example, if on node selected you want to display another window containing something to do with that node, you just listen to the node selected event and fire off that. So again, the programming model is much more familiar to sort of the swing style programming than the classic big blocks of JavaScript. I suppose it's similar to like the DOM events, which you'll get more low level JavaScript libraries. So just to kind of, I talked earlier about object orientation, but what does that actually mean in terms of JavaScript? JavaScript is a functional language with some weird aspects of it's a prototypical language rather. So what we have is Ext rather helpfully has this namespace support, so you can effectively package your code. Because one of the problems with early JavaScript was that everything was mashed into the global namespace, which meant that libraries didn't tend to play nice because they trample all over each other's variables and functions. So what we have is we have a namespace definition. This is optional. It depends if you're using a custom namespace. Then we have a constructor. So we basically assign the constructor to an object variable. And the very important part is the superclass.constructor.call, and this enables you to do the sort of the equivalent of super in Java. And then also very important, we have the inheritance. So Ext.extend allows you to take any JavaScript sort of object and create a subclass of it, which inherits all the methods and properties of the parent object, but also allows you to override, add methods, override methods, etc. And you basically and this itself again is an object literal. So you see the big curly braces with the key value pairs. So obviously there are some sort of challenges integrating Ext with DWR. Perhaps this is the main use cases for integrating Ext and DWR are about, because DWR gives you the ability to get stuff from the server and to push changes back. So obviously forms are an important part of that. I mentioned earlier the notion of a store, which is Ext abstraction over the data. And finally, there's trees which are obviously require server callbacks in order to lazy fetch data. And optionally there's state management, but that's less important. So this is kind of a typical definition of a store, albeit one with this custom DWR proxy class, which we've written. It's basically specifying a DWR method to call, and it will then fetch the data back and then throw it through this reader, which transforms it into the format that Ext expects. And then you can bind that to a grid or to a to a form. Probably, I suppose, it's probably a bit low level at this stage if you've not kind of experienced what Ext is. So perhaps we might jump ahead a little bit and.
Basically, in the examples you showed Ext, the way you're configuring it, you're basically using JSON just to kind of actually construct objects. And then obviously you've got JSON coming from the server. So are there stores and those different abstractions you're talking about? Those are the ways of basically taking that data and effectively making it usable by Ext. Is that what you're saying?
Transforming it into a form that you can use. But I suppose you almost touched on the point, which is that one very cool thing you can do with Ext, because pretty much everything is JSON, and you can get JSON from the server. Your page layouts themselves can actually be stored and retrieved dynamically and streamed from the server. That's it's a bit of a crazy use case, but you can do some really cool stuff with that. Basically, on the fly reconfiguring your user interface. And actually, I might if I can Google this.
So I did have one question relating to that, and that's because you mentioned that when you're using Ext, it really shines when it comes to actually doing things like layouts. I mean, does that leave you with nothing to do as far as actually creating HTML is concerned?
That is an interesting point. Yes, you can actually do you can actually do user interfaces without any HTML. Now you may not think that may not be.
Would you do that? Would you do that?
At the moment, I've been kind of getting away from actually doing any HTML because the thing with Ext is because it handles the rendering and the markup and generating the HTML for you. You don't, if you're going for a pure Ext widget approach, you don't actually need to do any HTML. Which, okay, let's see if I can make the screen big enough to see. This is, I suppose, the indication of how powerful Ext is. It's a GUI build. It's an Ext GUI builder, which itself is an Ext application. So let's start by dropping a form panel in there. And so let's get forms. This tool is great. It's just an example of one of the user submitted extensions. Some guy just bust out this application where you can drop. Let's drop a text field on there. Change the properties.
So does that work in any browser?
Yeah.
Oh, superb.
I think I might have probably got IE running. It works. Okay, let's just for my next trick, I'll show you in IE7 in Windows. So there we go. Drop a form panel. This is a great way of kind of playing with layout, and you can use this to help design your thing. And of course here, one of the most important options is show edit JSON. So this is what it's actually used to construct the thing. So I can now bung that to my clipboard, paste it into my application, and that's my GUI. Obviously, in this case, we haven't added any handlers because this is somewhat dumb. It doesn't. You typically want to add listeners to actually add the interaction. But in terms of like laying out the fields, you can drop that and get all this sort of stuff for free. So like date picker.
So what is your backing language, technology? Is it a Java server page or is it?
Well, no, the Ext is entirely technology agnostic. A lot of people are doing Ext with PHP because it really just, you could potentially have your server as being kind of dumb data store because it just serves up. Basically provides JSON data stores, serves up stuff and accepts data back. Ext is also happy using XML, but you have to. It provides XML reading components and stuff like that. So you could have it serving on XML and consume that. So okay, well I guess I'm just gonna skip right ahead to the demo. Because I'm conscious of a slightly short time. So okay, on with the pet clinic. So this is the pet clinic application. Your first reaction is probably as mine was, which is like, hello, 1998, cool, they were that back. But it's very, for a couple of very simple use cases. And obviously, with a lick of CSS paint, this wouldn't look quite as Spartan as it does now. So we've got a couple of use cases. So find owners. There's one owner who ends with F, and if I find all owners, I get some owners, and then click through some detail. Very exciting. So equally, you've got this case of find visits. Right? You know, this is Spring MVC, but it could be structs. You know, it's all very straightforward MVC data binding sort of stuff. Really nothing interesting there. So I guess you might find interesting though is the DWR list. Right. So this is sort of a replication of the same page implemented as the DWR. And I hit search and I get some results back. So let's just see what that actually, how that's actually implemented. So to implement this owner search, right, which we've just seen, it basically it accepts a search parameter and then fetches the data back from the server. And actually, if we look, because I'm using Firebug, I can actually see what it sent back. Now, what you'll notice about this is this doesn't actually quite look like JSON. This looks more like JavaScript because, in fact, Ext JSON serializer is somewhat more efficient. What it does is it knows that the object, it won't duplicate references of objects, so it constructs the object tree using just straight JavaScript. But the end result is when it reassembles it at the end, is that you end up with a JSON, basically with a JavaScript object tree. So if we just G. So that's what it does, and if we look at the code that actually did this, as you can see, there's almost nothing to it. So this is just straight DWR. We have a form. We have a form field called surname, and then we just use the DWR utility file to get file document find by ID, and that gives us the. And then we remove all rows from the owner table, and then we just call find owners, and we pass that. And the other important thing to understand with DWR is callbacks. Because this is asynchronous, you can't just carry on because it's got to go to the server and then do something. Whenever the server's ready and it's processed, it will call you back. So you pass in a callback function. And then it will call the callback function with the value of the return. So I know that in my DWR clinic, find owners. Find owners here. So as you can see, it accepts a string and returns a collection. So in my JSP, I've got it accepts a string, and then in the callback, I get the collection passed back. And then just using this a convenient class which DWR provides, which is the DWR util add rows, because it's a common use case. But you can do that however you want to marshal this and the other. Now, I mean, this is kind of cool. It's it's no great shakes, but it's just a very simple introduction of how you actually fetch like tabular data from the server. And similarly, if we look at I've got a very similar page. And in this case, I've just used a regular calendar widget just to make it a little bit prettier. So it's the Dynamo calendar, which is a common one used out there. And again, I can just hit search. So if we look at the code for that, you'll see it's very similar, same idea. So really, it's that. Again, you're very familiar with row creation. You have the get by ID, remove all rows, find the data. Job's good. So doing that sort of stuff with DWR is very easy. So your steps to first getting DWR on board, get it configured, get a few beans out there, try exposing some methods, play with the test page, and create some pages, some simple pages which will fetch using data. A very common use case for this is the old dependent select problem. So say, for example, you've got two select boxes, and you want, one contains countries and another contains cities. Obviously, you don't want to load 1,000 cities, so you only want to load the cities for the countries that you've selected. Well, that's trivial with DWR, because you basically just say, whenever I change my city, whenever I change my country, go to the server, fetch the cities, load them into the server. It's really, very easy, very lightweight. So, I guess the takeaway is that you want to check out DWR, even if you're not ready for the Ext experience. Okay, so that's so far so straightforward. The DWR is easy. It makes what used to be a very hard thing very simple. Just so here, this is kind of the sort of the Ext, slightly pimped pet store, which provides pretty much the same use cases, but I don't know. I think it looks damn sight better. So here we've got an example of a tree. Well, this is being loaded by DWR. So this tree is basically just, if we actually look at what's just happened here, the tree is done a find owners call, and so we can basically now do stuff like edit owners. So we'll just save it back and change his name, something silly. We'll see that it's changed. Load him up again. Very, and as you can see, very snappy. Very low latency. So here you can see what's actually gone through. I mean, if you aren't currently using Firebug and you're doing any kind of development like this, it's a godsend. It really is, because I can now drill into this and I can see what actually is happening. So this is how DWR actually marshals up the parameters. Another example is I've got a little tree panel, which is it's basically the same thing as the DWR panel we saw a minute ago, except done with Ext. Using exactly the same server-side, using exactly the same server-side method, but it just, as you can see, it looks cool. I get free sorting. I get column selection. I get drag and drop. I haven't enabled it on this one, but I also get grouping. So, okay, let's switch to the visits. So here was an example of a data picker. So there, you'll notice there, the brief flash there, it's a bit too quick, but actually I'll show you what it looks like. Let's make it a bit slower. We'll see what it does. So if we go find the visits. There we go. You'll notice we get a nice mask loading, and this is automatic. What I'll do is I'll provide this project for download at some point in the next few days once I get it uploaded. So we'll provide the link through the blog. But so here, and again I've implemented a. You'll see that actually that's the rich text editor. It's pretty slick. So, as everyone sort of comfortable with what it's doing.
So did you use the Ext builder to build that, or
no? I did this one by hand because it's quite simple. But yeah, I mean, the Ext builder is a really great way of getting started because often, I mean, if you haven't used it, then it's really hard to visualize what the hell this is going to look like. But I'll actually say that one of the important lessons about Ext is that it's so cool. You've got all, you've sort of been let loose in the candy store. The important thing is to keep focused on one thing at a time. Like learn one feature at a time. Try and get one feature working at a time. Like grids, for example. Try and just focus on that before trying to get everything else. Because if you try and do like a multi-pane application like this at once, you'll break one thing and you'll just tear your hair out. So try and do everything and try and learn things in isolation, and then gradually put them together. And that'll make the learning curve a lot less steep.
Hi Lewis, can I ask you about one question about the tables?
Yep.
What's the performance like compared with other JavaScript frameworks that may be out there?
It's really good. One thing you've got is you've got pagination. There's also a plugin which does virtual scrolling. You may have seen it in some of the search engines. I think Yahoo does it, where what they do. I actually know if you use Yahoo Mail, you get a view of your whole mail and a scroll bar down the side. So you might have 1,000 mails. You can start scrolling down, and it'll get loaded, and it will load them on demand. Well, there's a plugin which does that. Obviously, you're not going to, because JSON doesn't